What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. It's late at night and we're building Valgavoth. If you guys are here for the Precon upgrade, that's not this is a non-budget deck list, but if you are wanting those Precon upgrades, I'll leave them linked here and in the description down below. I read the comments and it's very clear you guys wanted a non-budget deck list, so here is that deck list. Notably, you're probably not going to make very many friends with this deck. This deck ended up pretty powerful because we did go with a pretty powerful strategy. So let's shout out those patrons and get right into it. Irrelevant, you rock. Hey guys, if you guys want a free $15, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. Really helps me out and you guys get free money. Another thing that really helps me out is liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. So if you guys are loving these Duskmourn commander decks and the speed I'm delivering them to you, a like and a comment goes a very long way. Now, let's get into the overall strategy of the deck and what Valgavoth is trying to do. He's a simple demon that likes blood, so we're going to give him blood. Specifically, whenever our opponents draw cards, which is what people love to do in Magic, we're going to punish them for that. So their Cataract Parasite effects and the new one from Duskmourn, whose name escapes me because it's a new card, is going to be perfect in this deck, along with other effects, like our Blood Chief's Ascension. This card cannot be ignored because the synergy is amazing. You have to put counters on Blood Chief's Ascension, but you get counters on it by dealing damage to your opponents consistently every single turn during their turn. So one rotation and Blood Chief's Ascension is going to be online. That's absolutely broken. Now whenever any card enters their graveyard, they're going to be taking 2 life and we're going to be gaining life. The synergy here could not be ignored, so we are going Wheels. And Wheels is just going to be a super powerful strategy that synergizes amazingly with the commander and dealing consistent damage to our opponents. Another thing we're going to trickle in there is just a demon strategy or a demon sub-theme. What do demons like? Other demons, right? Maybe? No idea, but we're going to have big demons in this deck and we're going to pair our Wheel strategy with a demon reanimator strategy because demons are expensive and we don't want to cast any of them. So we're just going to wheel them into the graveyard and reanimate them and have broken demons like Archfiend of Despair. Really good here because we're dealing damage to our opponents during their turn, and then Archfiend of Despair is just going to double up on that damage. Another thing that's really cool about Archfiend of Despair is it also doubles up on life lost, so it works with our Blood Chief's Ascension effects. Archfiend of Ifnir is another demon you have to consider when we're talking about these wheel strategies. All it takes is one wheel effect and you can wipe your opponent's board off the face of the earth. But make no mistake here, Valgavoth is going to be the star of the show. We're going to protect this guy at all costs, make sure we're getting our 3 cards per rotation, and then he's going to get massive. So we're going to abuse his power later on in the game with cards like Reaver Cleaver, just allowing us to smack our opponents for a ton of damage while generating a ton of mana is just not okay and will lead us into having all the mana we need to cast these wheel effects to finish off our other 2 opponents, because in all reality, one of our opponents is probably going to die to commander damage. So before we get into it, there's a lot of interactions, a lot of key pieces whenever we're talking about these wheel effects, and a lot of board states that cause us to win the game out of nowhere, so we're going to cover all of them. So let's get right into it. We're going to kick it off by talking about the cards that can consistently trigger our commander Valgavoth. That way, if you don't want to take him in the same strategy that I'm taking him, at least maybe you'll get some cool tech to trigger your commander. Rug of Smothering is super simple here. Whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 1 life for each spell they've cast this turn. So it's kind of like a backwards Aetherflux Reservoir that's really going to punish those Storm players. Not to mention, as long as everybody's casting at least 1 spell per turn, we are triggering our commander very consistently. Soot Imp, very similar. Whenever a player casts a non-black spell, they lose 1 life. So again, triggering our commander very consistently as long as everybody's playing 1 non-black spell a turn. It's not going to trigger every time, but pretty consistently, right? Cemetery Gatekeeper is a pretty interesting one here. When he enters the battlefield, we get to exile a card from a graveyard. And then whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper is going to deal 2 damage to that player. Notably, we want to be looking for those fetch lands in the early game. As soon as we see a land hit the graveyard, we need to cast this guy ASAP. Not to mention, getting a creature under this guy's not terrible as well, as long as you know what kind of deck you're playing against. Bloodseeker, whenever a creature an opponent controls enters the battlefield, they lose 1 life. Really good against token strategies, and again, really consistent at triggering our commander. Rolling Vortex is one of the most consistent cards to trigger our commander because it just has some simple text. At the beginning of each upkeep, Rolling Vortex deals deals 1 damage to that player. Super simple and super effective. Barbed Wire is super similar. This guy comes down and says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, Barbed Wire deals 1 damage to that player. Again, low CMC, super simple, and it gets the job done. Gibbering Fiend is going to take a little bit of setup, but it's very similar to our Rolling Vortex, which we love here. It's only 2 mana, and then as long as we have Delirium up to 4 card types in our graveyard, which is not hard to do in a wheel deck, it's going to deal 1 damage to each of our opponents at the start of their upkeep. So again, we're triggering our commander 3 times a turn like we need to. Pyrohemia is a little more expensive. I wanted to keep these super cheap, that way we can always get them down before our commander, but I kind of made the exception for Pyrohemia here just because it's amazing board control. It's going to hate out all the token decks. They're just going to not be able to play the game. And then additionally, as long as we have 3 red mana up, we do the thing to trigger our commander, and we're very consistently going to get that amazing card advantage. Chandra's another one that I made an exception for just because this girl's really cool. She actually gives opponents emblems, and then those emblems deal 1 damage to that opponent at the start of their upkeep. The reason this is so good is because there's actually no meaningful way to interact with emblems. Once they have that emblem, they're going to be taking damage for the rest of the game indefinitely, and we can start stacking those emblems. That's not the goal of the deck, but it's still pretty funny. Additionally, Chandra is just super flexible. She can be very good removal, so we can start stacking up those emblems until we need to remove something, and then we just lower her loyalty and take out whatever key pieces we need to take away from our opponents. Now we're going to move on to the pieces that trigger Valgavoth consistently, but also synergize with the wheel strategy. Notably, again, if you're not going with wheel strategy, these are still going to be very good in your Valgavoth deck. They just get a lot better whenever you pair them with wheels. Keterek Parasite, Razorkin Needlehead, and Underworld Dreams are very simple. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they're going to take 1 damage. Again, very easily triggering our commander 3 times a rotation without any effort. Ob Nixilis, Fate Unraveler, and Spiteful Visions do something very similar. They're just a lot more expensive. Notably, you will want to watch out for Spiteful Visions because it deals damage to you as well. There is a little bit of life gain in this deck to mitigate that, but just keep in mind if you don't have any life gain or a ton of life to use, I would sandbag this one until you do get some life gain on the battlefield. Because remember, they're going to be drawing upwards to 2 cards a rotation, but you're going to be drawing upwards to 6. So just keep that in mind whenever you play this guy. That's going to bring us to Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Now we're getting that life gain that we very much so needed, and it does damage to our opponents whenever they draw cards. So now, not only are we gaining a ton of life, which is going to be really hard for our opponents to deal with, they're taking a lot of life loss off of this guy. Bloodchief's Ascension is going to be very similar here. This thing is not hard to get online, like I said in the intro. It synergizes with exactly what our commander is trying to do. So 1 rotation, this thing's going to be online, and then it's a lot more broken than just a discard payoff, which is what people use it as and view it as 90% of the time. But let's think about someone casting an instant. Well, that instant's going to go for the graveyard. Boom, trigger Bloodchief's Ascension. A creature dies, it goes to the graveyard, trigger Bloodchief's Ascension, and then when we wheel and make them discard a card, yep, we're going to trigger Bloodchief's Ascension. This card is just broken in this deck. Another card that's just outright broken that we're going to run is Orcish Bowmasters. Now, if you guys don't know how this interaction works, 1 wheel effect will have each opponent drawing 7 cards, right? So we get to deal 21 damage to one of our opponents and then amass 21 times. Notably, the amass is kind of messed up here because as long as the Orc token was already on the battlefield the previous turn, or we just flashed it out on someone's end step, that means that the Orc token can attack right away. So we get 21 damage off of our wheel effect, and then we get this Orc token that entered previously that already is a 1/1, so we can deal 22 damage worth of combat damage to another player, or just the same player, right, and just kill someone outright. I will say I would not play this in a deck where people aren't ready for it. You know, don't go pub stomping with this one. This is a pretty powerful card, and if people aren't ready for it, they're gonna get salty. But Sheoldred was already in the deck, so I said F it. You get it. The next card we're gonna talk about is Psychosis Crawler. Now this one triggers whenever we draw a card, which happens a lot, right? Remember, we're drawing upwards to 4 or 5 cards a rotation. That's upwards to 4 or 5 damage a rotation that our opponents have to deal with, in addition to all of our other just pinging damage dealers. It can kind of get to a point where our opponents are just going to die because we've done enough chip damage to them, and then whenever we wheel, yep, this is going to deal a lot of damage as well. Let's talk about some Underworld Breach interactions, because Underworld Breach is absolutely fucked up in a wheel strategy. The first one we're going to talk about is Bone Miser, Dark Deal, and Underworld Breach. What's going to happen here is very simple. We're going to cast our Dark Deal, we're going to discard a lot of cards, and as long as we discarded 2 land cards, that's going to give us 4 mana from our Bone Miser. And then we do want to at least discard 1 non-land card every time we cast Dark Deal, because Dark Deal says each player discards all the cards in their hand, then draws that many cards -1. We want it to net even at least, that way we don't end up discarding our entire hand, which is what's going to happen to your opponents, because each time you wheel your opponents, they're going to draw 1 less card. So eventually, they're just not going to have any cards in their hand. They're going to discard 0 cards and draw 0 cards while we draw our entire deck, because Bone Miser comes in clutch here. Not only does Bone Miser give us the mana to recast Dark Deal, additionally, as long as we keep discarding non-creature cards, we're drawing additional cards along with the cards that we draw off of our Dark Deal. So we're actually gaining increasingly more and more cards instead of getting less and less cards. It's really broken. You can kind of do the same thing with Waste Not. The only problem with using Waste Not instead of Bone Miser is that Waste Not triggers off of our opponents. So eventually, whenever they run out of cards to discard, we're going to run out of mana and card advantage. But 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be honest, you just kill them before that happens. Another really broken card with Underworld Breach is Path of the Pyromancer. What happens is you discard all the cards in your hand, and then you add 1 red mana for each card discarded this way, then you draw that many cards +1. So as long as you're able to discard 5 cards, add 5 red mana to your mana pool, and then Underworld Breach is on the battlefield, you can easily just escape Path of Pyromancer again to discard 6 cards this time, adding 6 mana, then 7 cards, then 8 cards, and eventually you're going to find the key pieces you need to kill your opponents, and we're going to draw our entire deck while doing that. Psychosis Crawler just wins here, right? You can kind of do the same thing with Jeska's Will and Reforge the Soul, right? Because you add 7 mana using Jeska's Will, then you can escape Reforge the Soul. Reforge the Soul fills your graveyard. That way you can escape Jeska's Will and then Reforge the Soul again. I just think that Path of the Pyromancer is a cleaner way to do this. Then we just have some more solid wheel cards like Molten Psyche. Now this one is really good if we can force our opponents to draw a ton of cards. Then we can cast this, and as long as we have Magecraft, we might be able to just go ahead and kill all of our opponents. Wheel of Misfortune is sneaky good here. Not only does it get our opponent's life total even lower if they don't want us to draw any cards, but additionally, if we have something like Orcish Bowmasters in our hand, we can go ahead and wait for them to want to get a new entire hand. Then we flash out Orcish Bowmasters and deal a ton of damage to them, or we can just look to the guy on our right, realize, hey, with the stuff we have on the battlefield, if he chooses to wheel, he's just going to die, so he has to choose 0, and then we can very easily choose 1 and get an entire new hand for just 3 mana, which we're happy to do. Dragon Mage is super solid here as well. He's a wheel on a body, so we can hit someone for 5 damage while getting an entire new hand, and then 9 times out of 10, we're just going to reanimate this guy. We don't want to be casting this guy for 7 mana. We want him on the cheap, get him in the graveyard, reanimate him, easy game. Winds of Change is a card I don't usually include in my wheel strategies because a lot of the wheel strategies need opponents to discard cards for them to take damage, but in this deck, we actually went with them drawing cards to deal damage instead because that synergizes more with our commander. So Winds of Change is actually pretty good here and just deals a ton of damage to our opponents while ensuing a little bit of chaos, and who doesn't love a little bit of chaos, right? I'm also a big fan of Baylor here. Not only is he a demon, and I kind of wanted to shove more demons in this deck just for a cool aesthetic while we're killing our opponents, they're going to look over and see a lot of demons. Gonna be pretty awesome. He also really synergizes with the deck because he forces opponents to draw cards and discard cards, which is just going to deal more damage to them. Then he's smacking someone for 5 damage and making someone lose damage equal to the amount of cards in their hand. All very good ways to deal a ton of damage to our opponents. Scourge Familiar is also very useful here. Let's say we have a wheel, but we have 5 cards in our hand. Well, let's just discard 4 out of the 5 cards, and that 5th card being our wheel, then we can wheel, and now we have a ton of mana to use with our fresh new grip. He also has a lot of synergy with Bone Miser. All we have to do is discard a non-creature card. Now we're drawing cards while adding mana to our mana pool, and we can kind of just do that till we find the cards we need. Now, it can whiff once we run out of non-creature cards, right? We're not going to be able to draw any more cards off of Bone Miser, but it can still just work in a pinch and it's a synergy worth noting. Last but not least, before we move on to the rest of the deck, we are also running Archfiend of Ifnir. If you guys have ever played against this while your opponents are playing a wheel strategy, you know that this is just an oppressive card to play against, and it keeps your opponent's boards off of the table. They're not able to leave any meaningful creatures on the battlefield because you just keep wiping their entire board. Alright, let's talk about some powerful things we can be doing with our commander in the mid to late game once he gets big. And guys, this guy gets a lot bigger than you think, a lot faster than you think. One rotation and we're putting 3 counters on him. Now he's a 7/7, he goes to a 10/10, then he's a 13/13. Someone's gonna die somewhere in between there, right? It's going to be very easy to at least off one of your opponents with commander damage. The Reaver Cleaver is going to be perfect here. Now we're just generating a ton of treasure and a ton of mana whenever we're hitting our opponents and dealing a lot of damage to them. Ruthless Technomancer kind of does the same thing here. If we're trying to go off and win the game and we need a lot of mana to do that, we don't need our commander anymore. He's done his job. Additionally, Ruthless Technomancer has a really cool interaction with our commander. His reanimation is actually off of the power of the creature, so we can actually sacrifice X artifacts and return target creature with power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Whenever he's got 13 power and we generate 13 treasure tokens, we can easily spend 4 of those treasure tokens to just bring our commander back to the battlefield. Altar of the Wretched is also really good for that final push. We just sacrifice our commander, draw a ton of cards, mill a ton of cards, and that's going to find us the key pieces we need to end out the game. And if it doesn't, Altar of the Wretched is just a very flexible card that makes a really big creature. And in this deck, again, when we're chipping away at our opponent's life totals, sometimes all we need is a really big creature to go out and end the game. Obnixilis, the adversary, can kind of be 2 things in this deck. It can draw us a ton of cards, or it can kind of act as a Death Star, right? Because it's going to enter the battlefield and it has casualty X, but all that means is we just have to sacrifice our commander and we get a giant Obnixilis that is ready to ultimate right away. And its -7 is target player draws 7 cards and loses 7 life. That's just not going to be okay with the Keterek Parasite on the battlefield. We're going to point that at one of our opponents and they'll instantly take 14 points of damage. Or we can just point it at ourselves, take the 7 damage and draw 7 cards. Chandra's Ignition is also a very viable way to win the game, especially when we have stuff like Psychosis Crawler and our commander that are just massive. I can definitely see a scenario where we just cast this, wipe the entire board, and kill all 3 of our opponents. And if not, it's just a very flexible card that wipes the board, and then we have this massive commander on the battlefield that they're not going to be able to deal with. Shadow Spear is just another solid way to gain some life in the deck. We're also playing Brash Taunter here. This was in the Precon, and I kind of thought it was funny, so I kept it in this deck as well. What you do is you have Brash Taunter fight your giant commander, and then someone just takes a bunch of damage. Pretty simple, pretty funny. You guys can cut it if you want, but I kind of thought it was funny, right? Archfiend of Despair, as said in the intro, this card's absolutely messed up here because it's just going to double the damage and the life our opponents are losing each turn. This can very easily cause them to just lose the game out of nowhere if we get this guy on the battlefield at the right time. Omnixilis Captive Kingpin also has a ton of synergy with this deck. There's a lot of cards in this deck that just deal 1 damage to our opponents or make them lose 1 life. So this guy's going to get massive and provide a ton of card advantage. He's going to basically be like a second backup commander to the deck. Animate Dead, Necromancy, and Reanimate are going to be our reanimation pieces of choice because they're just super efficient for what they do. Chainer Nightmare Adept, also very good. Allowing us to cast creature cards from our graveyard is just very amazing here, especially whenever we're wheeling a lot of them to the graveyard. And then additionally, it's going to give any card we reanimate haste, or any card we cast from exile, right? Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, Champion's Helm, Mirror Shield, we need to protect our commander. He is very vital to this strategy, so I wanted to put a ton of protection pieces in this deck. We're also running Tybalt's Trickery, Bolt Bend, Imp's Mischief. Again, protecting the commander should be the #1 goal here. We need him to stick on the battlefield so we can keep drawing a ton of cards. Malakir Rebirth, also very flexible. It's just going to return him to the battlefield if they actually do end up removing him. Whew, alright guys, that's the end of the deck tech. Remember, don't forget to leave some love in the comments down below if you like these extra long videos where I go deep into the interactions, talk about all the synergies, and hopefully you guys end up walking away with a pretty good idea of how I envisioned this deck to work and how it's supposed to perform when you're playing against your opponents. With that being said, thank you guys for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Now let's shout out those patrons. Irrelevant, The Professional Heal, Excessum, Chicken Salad, and Praetor. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped everybody in their deck building endeavors, and I will see you guys in the next one.